Coming up on Theater Talk.
Essentially, Williams made a Faustian bargain with himself. He starts to use drink first to loosen him up and get him going, but then his alcoholism becomes his subject.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation and the Honorable Thomas Mercer Ray. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. You know, Susan, for years, my favorite theater book of all time has been The Diaries of Kenneth Tynan, edited by John Lahr of The New Yorker. But I must say, there's a rivalry for my affections in great theater books. John Lahr is with us tonight with another absolutely superb book, Tennessee Williams' Mad Pilgrimage of the Flesh. John Lahr, welcome to Theater Talk.
Nice to be here.
I don't know what it says about me, but I am attracted to two books by people who wound up with very sad and very tragic lives, Ken Tynan and Tennessee Williams.
Well, they didn't have altogether sad lives. They had an enormous ride, real acceleration, and I don't think any playwright had both a greater rise in American popular culture than Williams, or a sort of more precipitous decline, you know, which from a narrative point of view is terrific in some way. From his personal point of view was shocking and hard to deal with, and interesting because he tried to figure out how the public changed and meet the public shift of consciousness almost. And he actually wrote an extremely good play, which I saw and reviewed, called The Gnatigus Fraulein, which is a kind of Ionesco pastiche, but which is surreal and bitter and really embracing the criticism of him, mocking himself and his Southern manners and attitudes, and taking it farther. It was very prophetic and very painful and terrific theater. But the history of American theater is a history of first nights. And this first night was not that well directed by Alan Schneider, and so the play sort of disappeared from the discussion, but it was not a bad play, and nor was Vieux Carré, which lasted 4 nights on Broadway, I think, but had a really good revival in England. And one play, which was his last, A House Not Meant to Stand, I think. It's not, of course, as Williams knew, he was not the penetrating, intuitive, great playwright he had been, but he was still a very highly proficient technician.
He was skilled.
Yeah, very skilled, with lots to say. The work didn't have this sort of lyrical shellac of the early work, but it was still good stuff. And that play, which was done in Chicago with Greg Mosher, who I'm sure you've had on the show. When Greg became the head of Lincoln Center, he wanted to do it in New York, and it was stopped from being done in New York by the soi-disant executor of Williams' estate, Maria St. Just, my sort of comic figure in the play.
Exactly.
We don't know what that play is. I'm hoping that if this book does its work in the world, there may be some revival of interest in some of the later late plays that's not all of them stand up.
No.
But there are some that really are worth looking at.
Yeah. Before we get to the first act of his life, which was a great act, Tennessee Williams, you said you reviewed some of the later plays. Did you know him at all? Did you ever meet him?
I was, but long before you came to New York, Michael, I was the literary manager of Lincoln Center. And my first production there was a revival of Camino Real, starring none other than Al Pacino as Kilroy. And Tennessee came to that, and it was a big deal because as it turned out, the production really helped Tennessee, although it was a lousy production, in my view, although it got rave review in the Times. But Tennessee had to be, I'm not lying, literally lifted into his seat. And he was legless. And afterwards, he came backstage to see everybody. And it was very hard to understand that there's such a discrepancy between the perfected self of the writing and the imperfect, the imperfect author of the writing.
So was he legless because he was so intoxicated?
I think he was on pills.
Yeah, so stoned.
But I've subsequently, well, I mean, I wasn't studying him then.
Yeah.
Now, looking back on it and looking at what I try to explain in the book is that and this happens frequently. It happened with Noel Coward, for instance, where Noel Coward, when he couldn't find an audience for his work, took himself on the road. And in Coward's case, he had songs to sing.
Yeah.
And Williams didn't have that, but Williams put himself and his collapse and his theme, all his emptiness, which his plays expressed, that is to say, got out of him. He did in making a spectacle of his collapse in public. It didn't bother him that he fell down in public.
Really?
And these scenes, I mean, they weren't necessarily intentional, but they nonetheless had the same effect of putting the distress out of him into others. Others were very worried for him. He was stoned. He was okay.
Right.
You know what I mean? It didn't. He made jokes of it. You know, I fell down. I fell down many times, but I was never put down.
Was he making a spectacle of himself in a way to show people this is what they have
I
done
think
to me?
I think you know, it's instinctive. Thanks mainly to Tennessee and his memoir. People tend to define him solely in terms of his sort of sexual rapacity.
Right.
And in fact, the more defining thing about Tennessee is something more elemental. Tennessee called himself the definition of hysteria. And if you look at the etiology of hysteria, a lot of which has to do with showing off, with masquerade, with putting your feelings into other people, and then watching how they react to your inner life. It's just part of the behavior of a hysteric, which has a lot to do not only with Williams and how he responded to life, but also his plays, which are like case books. I mean, of course, I don't want to. It would be reductive to say that. You
don't trivialize the works at all. You speak of being reductive, but one does see over and over again how he's a completely narcissistic person, and in the beginning, that worked in his plays. The narcissism of the characters and the inner life of the poetry of their life works. But then, as he goes on later and gets more hooked up by his addiction, you see that it's working against him. It's defeating him.
Essentially, Williams made a Faustian bargain with himself. Somewhere in the 50s, he realized, and he writes about this in his diaries, that he was blocked. He couldn't write. He was struggling. And instead of engaging with the world, and his early plays are full of the sort of vivacity of someone who just finally seized his talent and his life, and it all came together. But at a certain point, and you can almost chart it, he starts to need, because he's now a successful writer, and he has to put out, and output is important, and there's pressure on him to do work, he starts to use drink first to loosen him up and get him going. But then his alcoholism becomes his subject. In Sweet Bird of Youth, there's at the very end, when Chance when the princess says, "Come with me, baby, and we'll go back to Hollywood," and he decides to say, and allow himself to be destroyed, castrated.
Yeah.
He says, life's got to mean something. So Chance destroys himself for meaning in the play. And Williams did that. I think Williams' bargain with himself on some unconscious level was, if you drink and drug like that, you are destroying yourself.
Right.
And what he did was he brought himself to the brink and watched himself at the abyss, so to speak, and chronicles the shifting sort of nuance. He's starting with brick and moving right along as he descends or surrenders to the self-destruction, which is absolutely prevalent from Streetcar. My approach has been that Williams called himself the most autobiographical of playwrights. And each play, he said, when he had a problem, he would project it into a simulacrum of that problem. And each play was good insofar, in proportion to the tensions in him that were released. So that if you followed the plays sequentially, you could map the shifting geography of his interior, which is what I wanted to do. So when we go see a Williams play, we're seeing it in the context of no context.
Right.
And what I was interested in doing is saying, no, it's wrong to say, it's wrong. These plays are written at in a particular point in time where he was a particular kind of person. And that, although it's, of course, true that, as you said, that he was narcissistic, like, did you know a novel writer that isn't?
No,
I mean, but what I mean to say,
I think so
self-involved, solipsistic.
Yes.
But you see, that, in a sense, is what he set out to do. At the very beginning, he wanted to write about his feelings in his inner life and project them out. But out of that very self-centered, you might say, concern, he created stories that transcend himself and also become metaphors. I mean,
characters. That
yeah, I mean, if you want a metaphor for the rapacity of post-war America, well, who better than Stanley? And what is sacrificed in order for his power and his needs to be satiated, you know, and so on.
But in his later life, when he got caught up in the fame machine, and after he broke with Kazan, and you know, didn't have somebody to coordinate his plays quite the same way, and sort of got, you know, Maria St. Just got her hands on him and things like that. Don't you think that he was caught, that he couldn't change it then? He was caught by his addiction disease. He was caught by his need to prove himself over and over again. And
no, I don't disagree with that to a degree, but the plays nonetheless show a shift.
Yeah.
There's more in them about as he shifts, where he gets caught up. For instance, the two-character play is a man who's lost in his own theater. He's completely lost all contact with the world at the time before his breakdown. I mean, so it dramatizes the kind of almost autistic enclave that Williams was in.
One thing I want to ask you, we think of him, the lyrical, the poetic Tennessee Williams, but in thinking of this book and going back over the plays, violence is a big part of those plays.
You bet.
And where is, in your exploration of him, where is that violence from inside coming from? What is the
Where is it from? He and his siblings were trapped in a family at war.
Yeah.
He had a father who called him Miss Nancy, who was dismissive of him as a child and as a potential writer, who pulled him out of university, made him go to work at the shoe factory, right, and essentially whom Williams, who was a very angry and violent man.
He was violent in his personal life?
Oh yeah, sure. And also, one of the confusions about the mother is a confusion established by Glass Menagerie, which is a musical version of who Edwina Williams was. I mean, Edwina was a nonstop talk. I mean, not to say that she was a nonstop talker, she was a narrative event. She just didn't let anyone in.
Yeah.
She talked, she dumped all her disappointment at her husband into her kids, and she turned all her children against the husband. So no wonder the husband was furious.
Who was it who wrote that she talked but she did not listen, and she smothered but she did not
love.
touch?
Well, that may be me.
That was you, I believe. Yeah.
But you see, there's a different. Maybe you had I don't know about your parents, but I really observed the difference between being an environmental mother, that is to say, a mother who worries about you, makes sure there's food on the table, packs your lunches, and one who actually understands who you are and wants you to be whoever you want to be. Now, it's true, and one of the interesting things is that, you know, hysterics become hysterics to a certain degree. They understudy their parents, and Williams' mother was a hysteric, as Williams said. And you know, you only could get her attention if you listened to her. but she made no sense. Williams found her confounding and confusing, and all these admissions about the father to him were distressing. And so you ask where the violence comes. It comes in that, you've got to look
With the
there.
anger.
It's out of the house.
Yeah, and also here's the worst one. Because the mother was a monolithic Puritan, that's Williams's quote. The sort of unspoken mantra of the household was, you can't have the feelings that you have. You can't have the sexual feelings.
It's tough when you're a gay boy.
You have to belt up
Yeah.
and live a good Christian life, you know, and forget about your instincts. Go back with the brutes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The instinct was verboten. Now, the only place where Williams can make himself known, make his real feelings known, is the theater, where he could actually admit himself and be admitted and be seen in a way. So that the theater, it's amazing to think that Williams had only seen 2 or 3 plays before he decided to be a playwright. And when he writes about that, he says he found that there was a theater inside him that wanted to come out. In other words, all these projections, all these feelings, he needed to get out, to almost see them, to understand them, because his life was so confusing.
To me, the most remarkable line that you have in this book is when Edwina, his mother, goes to see his play in the bar of the Tokyo Hotel.
Yeah.
It was in 1970. It failed, and it was a bad performance. And she says to him, "Tom, I think it's time you find another profession." and she wasn't kidding. And you thought, that says it all about this mother.
You know, when she died, Williams wrote to Kazan, or wrote back to Kazan, because they stayed in touch even after they split. They were as close as Williams could have a friend. And he said, look, she was only 4'11". My father was 6. She drove him out of the house. She turned both her sons gay, and she succeeded in having her daughter lobotomized.
Yeah.
You know, so that the perception of her as just a sort of put upon
Flighty.
Southern belle.
Well, or a scrappy woman in the Depression trying to get by.
In her book, which is worth reading because it is so, it's so mad. It's called "Remember Me to Tom."
Yeah.
Right. Also, the title is a put down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And in it, she refers, although her husband is dead, she can't give up her grievance, and she refers to her husband, whose name was C.C. Cornelius, as a man of wrath. But she herself was a kind of emotional terrorist. And so Williams was caught in this terribly crazy-making family. And Williams was lucky because he, in writing, could have external violence and inner oblivion, where Rose, after she was lobotomized, had the reverse. She had, you know, inner oblivion.
Yeah.
His sister, yeah.
Yeah.
You've seen, I assume, the early drafts of Tennessee Williams plays in his own hand. All of the stuff you keep saying that he's getting out, what do those drafts look like? I mean, is he a man who's writing stage directions, or is it just a cascade of words and scenes?
The answer is both. If you or I write a scene and we end the day in the middle of the scene, or let's say we write it, we think, oh, okay, well tomorrow, that was scene 2, we'll start at scene 3.
Right.
Not Tennessee. He would go back and he would scrap it and write another scene 2. What he did was a bit like pizza dough. He just pushed it out farther and farther, a little bit at a time. But when he wrote, and I described this, he just created a mess around him. You know,
Yes.
It was just, the mess in him was outside him.
The papers everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere.
Around.
And it's a great problem. When you go to the archives, you have massive number of outtakes. Rewritten scenes. I've seen scenes where actually you can go to the archive and read a whole little scene about how Blanche and Stanley get married and go off together. I mean, he tries it all. You know, he's just experimenting with different possibilities. You know.
Isn't that why Kazan was so important to him? Because he helped pull
put
it
the
together.
discipline.
Exactly so, Susan. Exactly so. Because, you know, Williams was a guy who grew up without a father, and a father teaches his son boundaries. He teaches him about reason. He teaches about order.
Teaches him how to grow up.
Yeah. Now, Williams didn't have that. And what he saw in Williams, I actually knew in Kazan. I met Kazan at the end of his life. And it was interesting because he was not, he was a little out of it intellectually. But what was so amazing about him was how forceful he was as a presence even then. I wasn't prepared for an old man who was so...
Dynamic.
Yeah, that's the word, dynamic. What Kazan offered Williams was a father. He took him in hand. He imposed order and structure on Williams' stuff. And most important, he called out of Williams his best writing because he would not accept stuff. He just said, like with Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, he said, "Ten, this just is not ready to show. You can do better." And it's hard to imagine when you see a play as fabulous as Cat in a Hot Tin Roof that Tennessee never had it in his mind to bring Big Daddy out in the third act.
Yeah.
Or he never had Brick have the dramatic progression that we all know and love. And this was all, it goes much farther than that because Rose Tattoo, which Kazan didn't direct, Tennessee rewrote from Kazan's outline. Camino Real, Kazan, on a trip from New York to California, took all the drafts that Williams had written, which were, I don't know, it was like a jigsaw puzzle, and threw everything out, organized it, and gave Tennessee a sort of game plan. It's possible to say Tennessee would have written those plays and they probably would have been okay, but they wouldn't have had the resonance, they wouldn't have penetrated the culture the way they did because they never would have had the narrative thrust. The thrust, which that's what Kazan was. He was a real phallic figure, and they wouldn't have the structure wouldn't have been there. And of course, it's the problem with playwriting is it's not W-R-I-T-E, it's W-R-I-G-H-T, like wheelwright. It's about construction. Tennessee was expressive and poetic, and that's one of the things he gave to the modern theater. But construction was not his strongest suit, at all.
Eric Bentley wrote in The New Republic and was sued by Arthur Miller for this. I think maybe Tennessee joined the suit. He said Kazan was the virtual co-author of the plays by Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams.
But I think that that was not fair of Eric to say, and it isn't fair in any case because it was There's a wonderful example in the book where in Camino Real, Kazan says, Tennessee, what about a speech for Esmeralda where she talks about all the outcasts, the bohemians, the ne'er-do-wells, and he just runs about. He's a great letter writer, Kazan, as you probably have talked about his selected letters on the show, and he said, "How about a speech like that?" And Tennessee takes the rhythms of Kazan's letter, absolutely the same music, and takes it but recasts it in his own, and it becomes the most famous speech in Camino Real. Yeah. So there's that synergy. At the New Yorker, every writer is edited, and every writer is improved by the editing. It's still your writing. Yep. And it just as it's still Williams, but Kazan's job is to take the writing and make it work dramatically. It's not like he gave Williams words. Right. Williams provided the words, but he gave Williams maybe strategies would be the best, things to think about, different kinds of things, to make it better or argue with. And because I guess Williams, he really understood Williams, because he understood an essential thing about Williams, because he was the same way. He understood that Williams's promiscuity was important to his creativity. That, Williams, had he not been promiscuous, would probably never have been the playwright that he was, because sexuality is the beginning of knowledge and curiosity. And it opened Williams up from this prim, preppy, repressed little sort of nerdy guy to a sort of carnal being, which is really his journey. Yeah. It's the journey, a sort of deliberate regression to a sort of, he says at the beginning of my book, I I have opposite the frontispiece, I quote, I show a picture of what he wrote in the collected poems of Hart Crane that he carried in his left pocket all through his early years. He says, I too am increasingly becoming, have a desire to become a savage and to create a new world. And he was willing himself, and he achieved into sort of a romantic transcendence, deliberately unlearning repression and becoming a person of instinct and carnality, you know. And what is the first thing in Streetcar? What is the first gesture in Streetcar? Stanley comes on, and what does he do? He comes in, and he throws something up to her.
Right.
And it's meat.
Right.
He's carnal. It's all about carnality.
Well, it's a brilliant book. Tennessee Williams' Mad Pilgrimage of the Flesh. Great, great book by John Lahr. Thank you very much for being our guest on
Pleasure.
Thank you. Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Loewe Foundation, the Cory and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency, and the Theater Development Fund's Technical Accessibility Program, which helps provide closed captioning.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.